r/NoSleep. Posted by u/Theeaglestrikes. I know what really killed the old western town of Calico. It came from the mines. My grandfather told me a horrifying story about something that happened in the town of Calico during the dying days of the Wild West. I finally summoned the courage to tell this tale to my grandson, and he insisted that I share it here. I'm not sure that the young boy fully believes me, but he never knew my grandfather. That man was many things, but he did not lie. He could not lie. My name is Elizabeth Langley. I am 82 years old, and I have lived in England for my entire life. I remember, when I was about 8 years old, asking my father about his home. He had a faint American accent, so I knew he had not always lived here. Oakley, California, my father answered. What a place. I miss it. Still, I wouldn't have met your mother if I hadn't moved to England. Why did you move here? Was it the war? I asked. I had always fantasized about America. I longed for the sun-drenched land of California, rather than the bleak remnants of a post-war London. This would have been the year of 1948. I was only a young boy. I must have been no more than 13 years of age when my father packed our bags. As you know, he is a complicated man. He never told me why we were moving. He just said he couldn't do it anymore, my father explained. My curiosity had been piqued. I had expected a simple answer, but my father had only left me with more questions. I knew I had to talk to my grandfather. I had to know more about what happened in America. I think, in hindsight, I would have preferred to live my life without this tale rattling around at the back of my mind. Whether you read ahead is your choice. It's not a story for children, my grandfather told me. Every Christmas, he would come to stay with us. Every Christmas, I pleaded with him to tell me about America. It wasn't until I turned 12 that he finally caved. He realized that I would never stop pestering him, I suppose. My grandfather, Harley, met my grandmother in San Francisco, and they moved to Oakley when my father was born. That didn't answer my question, though. What was so wrong with America? Why did they move to England? There was nothing wrong with Oakley, the dear old man explained to me. There had been nothing wrong with San Francisco, either. What haunted my grandfather was the life he had left behind. He had tried, for years, to flee from it. Nowhere was far enough. Even as he told me this tale, he admitted that traveling to England had never offered the respite he so desperately sought. He said that, perhaps, it was finally time he told somebody his story and lessen the burden. Before moving to San Francisco in 1896, my grandfather had been a prospector. He left home at the age of 16, moved from town to town, and eventually settled in Calico, California. Most Americans have probably heard of this western ghost town, but for those readers who don't know about it, the official story about this boom and bust town is that minerals dwindled, as they did in many western towns. The mines dried up. People moved away. However, Harley always insisted that something else happened in Calico. There was another reason that the townsfolk disappeared. It all started in 1895. My grandfather had already been living in Calico for 3 years. He had become a part of the community. He saw himself as more than a prospector. He had even considered settling there. There were a few handsome women in town that he said he would have considered marrying. He had plenty of friends. He enjoyed a drink or two in the saloon. What more could he want from life? Silver was already starting to lose its value, but my grandfather didn't care. He was only 21 years old in the year of 1895, but he was tired. He wanted more from life than mining for valuable resources. And he believed Calico could become more than a mining town. The silver rush didn't have to be the end of it. He believed it could be a place that people would call home. Obviously, that's not how things turned out, but Harley swore that the end of mining was not the thing that killed Calico. In December of 1895, things began to change in the town. People started to go missing. Any search efforts were half-hearted, unfortunately, as the icy nights deterred most people from exerting their full efforts. They wanted to stay indoors. Harley said that a prospector named Lester Grant talked of something he had found down in the mines. A new mineral. Something that would save the mine and, in turn, the people of Calico. Apparently, the prospector claimed it was something he'd never seen before. Perhaps it was even more valuable than silver. My grandfather and his friend laughed it off. They knew, as did everybody in the saloon, that Lester was a drunkard. He was always spouting nonsense to lighten the mood. Lester, as you might have guessed, was the first person to vanish without a trace. Others soon followed. All sorts of townsfolk. Miners, barbers, bartenders, and even one of the sheriff's deputies. That's when things became more serious. 12 people went missing in the first week. When the sheriff's deputy became the 13th to vanish, that's when the search parties became a little more frantic. One evening, when Sheriff Harper was drinking with Harley and his friends in the saloon, he urged them to not let word spread about the disappearances. He didn't want any outside law enforcement to get involved. The sheriff claimed it was just life on the frontier. There were so many possible explanations. Coyotes. Bandits. People smelling the end of the silver rush, perhaps. My grandfather wanted to favor the latter suggestion. Everybody favored that suggestion. It was better to assume that townsfolk had simply moved away, rather than assuming some harm had come to them. Still, Harley was a wise man, and he could not quite shake the feeling that nobody had left Calico. He couldn't stop thinking about what Lester had said. Harley continued to raise the issue in the saloon, night after night. James implored his friend to stop. He needed the mine. He needed the town. Like most people, James was too fixated on the dying days of the frontier to notice anything else. Another week later, after the total number of disappearances totaled 19 people, my grandfather's nightly saloon talk was interrupted. Martha, the bartender, finished her shift and joined Harley and his friends at their table. They immediately offered their condolences. A few days prior, Martha's sister had gone missing. My grandfather said that the bartender's haunted disposition filled him with great unease. She looked not like somebody in the throes of grief, but somebody with a terrible secret. Still, Martha did not stall. She did not mince her words. She said that she had seen her sister. One of the men at the table excitedly roared that they must notify the sheriff. Martha explained that the man did not understand. The previous night, she stood at her upstairs window and gazed out onto the sandy main road that ran through Calico. There, gazing up at her, was her sister. Only, it wasn't her sister. Not really. It was something in her sister's yellow sundress. My grandfather could remember exactly how Martha described the figure. I, too, can remember the exact wording. She painted a nightmarish picture that is permanently etched into my mind. I could scarcely see her in the moonlight, Martha said. My joy was fleeting. I soon realized that she had no discernible facial features. Just a mouth. A gaping mouth, black as the night. She was emaciated, yet so much taller than I remember. Her dress was torn. I could see so little of her, but I could hear her. Didn't you hear that sound last night? It was an inhuman, whistling scream. It sounded like an animal calling to the pack. Of course, most of the men at the table dismissed Martha, claiming that grief had driven her to lunacy. They hadn't heard a scream. They might have heard a few animals, but they heard no inhuman screams. My grandfather said that James simply looked at him with a pale expression. He whispered to Harley that he had heard a blood-curdling scream during the night. He thought he had been dreaming because it was a sound no human could produce, and it was certainly like no animal he had ever encountered. Harley told his friend that he knew who could help. The next morning, he and James did not join their friends in the mines. They traveled southeast, searching for a small tribe of Native Americans that lived towards the town of Yermo. Harley knew a woman named Angie, one of the elders. Over the years, he had sold various minerals to her from his prospecting ventures in local towns. My grandfather explained to James that Angie had told him stories of a terrifying creature, the Wendigo. Martha's sister did not match that description, but the encounter sounded like something beyond the realm of logical explanation. The elder had once told my grandfather that there were things which the white colonizers did not understand. If there were anyone who could explain what Martha saw, Harley swore it would be her. When the two men arrived at the tribal village, my grandfather said that Angie was already expecting him. She told him that something had been unearthed in Calico. It was an ancient thing that should have been left alone. My grandfather said that, 3 years earlier, the old woman cautioned him against prospecting in Calico. She said that land was fragile. Dark things lay there, and those dark things should not have been disturbed. Apparently, James looked even paler than the night before. My grandfather kept encouraging him to drink some water because he didn't want his friend to pass out on the journey back to Calico. And Harley wasn't finished. He needed to know more. He begged Angie to tell him what was happening to the people of Calico. My grandfather said the elder was far more terrified about this creature than any of the others she had discussed. She said one word, Diba'a. It is a creature worse than the Wendigo, she explained to my grandfather. There is a nameless force deep in the earth that calls out to desperate people. It calls to those who need something, much like the residents of Calico who face the extinction of their livelihoods. Harley inferred that Lester must have felt this force calling to him. There had never been a magical mineral in the mine that would solve all of their problems. Everybody in Calico wanted more. The force must have been calling to all of them. How long? My grandfather wondered. Would it be before everyone was gone? And Jeannie explained that the thirst cannot be quenched until the victim has become a Diba'a. Then, their mortal desires fade away. Instead, they thirst only for souls, draining the flesh and the spirit of all those who cross their path. The elder said it is a fate worse than death. When the soul is drained, the victim is denied passage to the afterlife. My grandfather heeded her warning and dragged James back out to the horses, preparing to race back to Calico. Before he could leave, however, Jeannie grabbed my grandfather's wrist and whispered into his ear. She told him that James had the thirst. She could see it. She begged Harley not to follow his friend into the mines. Harley did not reply. He said James smiled weakly at him before kicking his stirrups and commencing the ride back to Calico. My grandfather did not want to believe it. He couldn't believe it. He wanted to save his friend, but he couldn't lie to himself. He knew that James was already gone. His friend had heard the call of whatever sinister force lay deep in the earth, and his thirst would not be quenched until that call had been answered. As the pair rode back to town, the sun began to set on the horizon. My grandfather said that he felt apprehended by the sudden emergence of Calico on the horizon. Uncharacteristically for that time of night, there was not a single visible light. The town had been engulfed by the night. There was no light, no movement, and no sound. The two men unsaddled themselves and tied their horses to a post. James was shivering at this point, and my grandfather was starting to worry about him. He dipped his head over the doors to the local saloon, peering into the empty building. Nothing. Not a light. Not a sound. Not a person in sight. My grandfather told James that they needed to go straight to the sheriff. Keeping James in his line of sight, Harley led them across the isolated town. When they reached the sheriff's office, they were met with an open doorway. It led into blackness, but there was a kerosene lamp perched on a table in the center of the room. With great trepidation, my grandfather took a few cautious steps inside and called out for the sheriff. There was no response. He tiptoed towards the table in the center of the room, picked up the kerosene lamp, and spun in a circle to get his bearings. What my grandfather said he saw next is something that still chills me to the bone, so I have no idea how horrified he must have felt. It was the sheriff. He was not one of the Diba'a. He was not anything. The corpse lay on the hard floor, barely visible in the dim light of my grandfather's lamp. The man was a shell. That's how his corpse was described to me. It had been, much as Jeannie said, drained both in flesh and spirit. The sheriff had been reduced to little more than bones with bloody strips of flesh remaining. My grandfather said the skull was the worst part of the scene. The sheriff's skin was mostly intact, though gray and colorless, but his eye sockets were empty, and his skull was split roughly down the middle. Harley vomited. I'm not quite sure how he managed to hold his stomach as long as he did, but perhaps, despite his lengthy, detailed description, the whole ordeal only lasted a matter of seconds. Who knows? I did not want to press him on the matter. I was happy for him to move forwards with the story, though things only worsened. When my grandfather left the sheriff's office, James had vanished, much like the rest of the town. Harley called for his friend, but Calico was silent. Nobody responded. Not wanting to leave his loved ones behind, but understanding that the battle had already been lost, my dear old grandfather accepted defeat and began walking back to his horse, preparing to leave Calico behind. He untied his ticket out of that hellhole, mounted the saddle, and then looked back at the town. I still remember my grandfather's face as he reached this part of the story. The sheer horror. He asked me whether we could abandon the tale there. He said I could simply accept that he left Calico, and surely that was enough. But it wasn't. I had to know. I just had to know. There was a whistling scream. I did not need my grandfather to say any more than that. I knew it was the same as the one that both James and Martha had described. That's when my grandfather saw her. Martha. She burst through the saloon doors and sprinted onto the main road, tripping and falling. Presumably, she had been hiding in the building. My grandfather certainly didn't see her when he peered his head inside earlier, but he definitely saw her as she scrambled across the road on her hands and knees. And he saw the creature that followed her from the saloon, ducking as it slinked through the doorway. The Diba'a. This one was larger and ghastlier than the sister that Martha had described. From its nondescript shirt and ragged trousers, Harley could not identify which missing town member was stalking the bartender. He said he hardly had time to assess the scene. It was over before it started. The once human creature used its spider-like limbs to move at great speed towards its prey. Moonlight sufficiently illuminated the scene of horror that unfolded before my grandfather. The Deba lunged for Martha with one of the gnarly appendages that used to be its left hand, and it seized her by the throat. My grandfather said the bartender screeched at the top of her lungs, scratching at the Deba's left hand with both of hers, and furiously swinging both of her legs back and forth. It was a fruitless endeavor. Harley knew he should avert his gaze. He knew he should ride away and never look back, but he could not peel his eyes from the scene before him. Raising her off the ground, the Deba moved its right hand towards Martha's face. Suddenly, my grandfather understood what he had seen in the sheriff's office, and he understood what he was about to see. The creature formed a claw shape with its right hand and violently forced its thumb into Martha's right eye socket. My grandfather sobbed profusely as he told me this part of the tale. He said he had never felt so utterly helpless as he did when he watched one of his dearest friends suffer so slowly and agonizingly. Martha's screams grew in volume and ferocity. Harley watched as the creature suspended her in the air with the thumb that had pierced her right eye and released her neck with its left hand. Then, without pause, the Deba plunged its left thumb into her left eye socket. My grandfather assured me that Martha's screaming rivaled that of the Deba. It was almost as horrific. Almost. Lifting her body higher into the air, as if she were a trophy, the creature started to yank its hands outwards. Its thumbs were firmly lodged into the bloody sockets that had once been Martha's eyes. Her screeching grew to an unbearable volume. With an almighty tearing noise, the awful sound of Martha's agony ceased. The Deba stared longingly at the corpse it held in its two hands, and then it began to drink from the canyon it had formed between the two halves of Martha's skull. My grandfather said he uttered a sound. It was involuntary. He had managed to resist the urge to cry or scream, but, at this moment, he gasped. The creature stopped. It turned to face Harley. And that was when it started. What followed was a cacophony of whistling screams. They echoed across the town. Soon, creatures began to reveal themselves from the nooks and crannies of Calico. One of them was wearing a yellow sundress. My grandfather distinctly remembered her. I'm not sure how he made it to his horse, given that everyone else perished. Perhaps the Deba had been busy feeding when my grandfather first strolled through the town. Perhaps he had been fortunate enough to avoid them. Whatever the case, his luck had run out. His horse had been whinnying uncontrollably since he mounted it, possibly only standing still for so long because it was frozen in the same state of fear as my grandfather. At this point, Harley said his stallion seemed only too happy to oblige when he pulled at its reins and steered towards the road that led out of town. There was, of course, one last demon for my dear old grandfather to face before he could leave Calico behind for good. One last creature stood in the middle of the road to freedom. James. My grandfather said he was not surprised to see the gaping black hole of a mouth and those monstrous limbs, but that didn't make it any less painful to witness. Goodbye, old friend. Those were Harley's final words to James as he plowed onwards, head buried in his horse's mane of hair, charging towards his old friend and preparing for the cold embrace of death. And yet, it didn't come. When my grandfather opened his eyes, he was free. His horse had galloped far beyond the boundaries of Calico. Harley looked over his shoulder to see his old friend standing at the side of the road. He had stepped aside to let my grandfather pass. Perhaps James was not quite as far gone as the others. Perhaps he had retained enough of his humanity to resist the thirst just a little longer. Whatever the case, my grandfather survived to tell the horrible tale. Before moving to San Francisco in 1896, he said he traveled back to Yermo to see Anjini, though he steered clear of Calico. The elder said that some of the Calico townsfolk had survived that unspeakable night by fleeing to the hills. She told my grandfather that the Deba were not seen again. The tribe assumed that the creatures perished, given that they require continuous sustenance. Once the remaining townsfolk fled, the unnatural beings had no way to quench their thirst. They surely perished. That was the prevailing hypothesis. Other than the few Calico survivors and the people of Anjini's tribe, nobody ever learned of what happened in that town. In fact, Calico lasted for another decade. My grandfather explained that many of the townsfolk returned and tried to squeeze the last few drops of life out of the town before it was officially abandoned in 1907. Sometimes, I wonder whether it was abandoned because the creatures returned. Perhaps some of the fools came back because they thirsted for something. Maybe the mines called to them.